In a remote mountain desert in southeastern Utah, archaeologists unearth astonishing finds. 8,000-year-old traces of some of the earliest people in the American Southwest. But a bitter controversy overshadows the scientists as they struggle in the dust. A dark legacy from the past, which a new, high-tech breakthrough may finally dispel. I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we unearth the distant past of the ancient Americans. Next on Archaeology. In the American Southwest, Native American ceremonies still flourish. Each spring, the tribes celebrate the return of the sun's warmth and the renewal of life-giving rains. Prayers are dedicated to the 4 sacred directions, marked out by the daily path of Sun Father, who illuminates the living world by day and the underworld of the dead by night. Not all the rituals are solemn occasions. Each spring, the Southern Ute tribe holds a dance dedicated to the bear, the founding figure of their culture. Some stories tell how the Utes are descended of a union between a supernatural bear and a human warrior. Though the bear dance is mainly a social gathering, and it's the young women, not the men, who choose the dance partners, it is also a sacred celebration of the tribe's origins. Behind the power and vitality of these origin ceremonies lie some challenging questions for science. Just when and how did people first begin to live in the Southwest's parched desert landscapes? How did they develop their special knowledge of survival, passed down across generations? The clues lie buried here, in a cave site high up in a desolate Utah canyon where prehistoric people lived, hunted, and were buried from 20 to 80 centuries ago. But special problems loom for southwestern archaeologists. They must contend with the reckless looting of sites by pot hunters and collectors who churn up the soil layers so crucial to the archaeologist's understanding. And science also faces the opposition of many Native Americans, increasingly angry that archaeologists continue to disrupt the long sleep of their ancestors. But archaeology itself has not been blameless in the plundering of the Southwest. Digging in the name of science, scholars have treated the remains of ancient Americans as objects for clinical study, not reverence. Today, with the help of new technology and under the watchful eye of Native Americans, they are discovering that science need not disturb the spirits of the dead. It is a desolate, unforgiving land. To survive here, you need long experience and special knowledge of the desert's hidden resources. Here, the rainfall averages only around 14 inches a year, falling mostly in unpredictable thunderstorms in June and July, often as sudden destructive flash floods. A flood races quickly over rock-hard soil, leaving it almost as bone-dry as before. Despite precarious conditions, prehistoric farmers raised corn in canyons which are now arid, desolate, far from any modern habitation. They left evocative ruins of pueblos, the builders known to us in legend simply as the Anasazi, or Old Ones. Today we have a good idea of what happened to the Anasazi. Intense drought forced them to abandon most of their sites only a couple of centuries before the Spaniards arrived, and their descendants are living in the modern pueblos of today. But still the questions linger. Who came before the Anasazi? And how did people live before there was corn? Ancient images carved on the canyon walls seem to tell us of an older, legendary time before farming, when the hunting way of life first drew people into these barren canyons. To get enough to eat, the hunters led a mobile existence, sheltering in caves for a few months of the year before moving on. This was one of their stopping places. Old Man Cave near Blanding, Utah. Here, Phil Geib, an archaeologist working for the Navajo Nation, and Dale Davidson of the Bureau of Land Management direct a team of volunteers searching for elusive traces of those early hunters, known to archaeologists as the Archaic culture. It's a rare opportunity. The Archaic is one of the great unknowns in southwestern archaeology.
If you think about the number of archaic sites that anybody has dealt with here in the Southwest, the number in this part of the Southwest is like 3 or 4 sites total. You know, and how many Pueblo sites have been dug here? Thousands and thousands. So it's to work in a place like this, it adds a real important dimension.
In part, it's a preservation problem too. Here we have wonderful preservation. We're in a shelter, and these early deposits have been totally preserved. They haven't been flushed away. A site like this, of this age, 8,000 years ago, if it was out in the open surface out here in the valley, has a good chance of either eroding away or being buried by other deposits, so it's totally invisible to archaeologists, and we have a hard trouble locating those kinds of sites. Here, the materials is preserved, and it's preserved so well that we have organics, yucca and grass fiber that date back 8,000 years ago, or about 8,000 years ago.
It was an unusually well-preserved object that first alerted them to the potential of the site. On a visit to the vaults of a local museum in 1988, they spotted a sandal woven from yucca fiber that had been collected from the surface of the cave. They had once suspected that the site must have remarkably intact remains from the Archaic, but when they hiked to the cave, they found it riddled with the holes of collectors and pot hunters.
As you can see all around us, this part of Old Man Cave has been very heavily disturbed by looters in the past. Maybe as long ago as before the turn of the century, in the 1880s and 1890s. Maybe only a matter of a few years ago.
The 1880s and 90s were the heyday of the collectors who ransacked sites to fill museums back east. Richard Wetherell and his 4 brothers were Colorado cattle ranchers who led an expedition in 1893 into the tortuous canyons of Utah's Grand Gulch. At a single cave, Wetherell unearthed 97 skeletons in 4 days, shipping them back east to museums where the bones still lie boxed up, virtually unstudied to this day. Though his methods were crude, Wetherell was one of the first to record his finds with notes and photos. And he realized that the Anasazi were not the first visitors to the site.
There are some of the early relic hunters that I like to think of as archaeological explorers rather than vandals, because they were practicing the archaeological science of the day, if you will. We wouldn't do science like that, we wouldn't do archaeology like that anymore. But I think that they're in a different class than people who were just here to get some pots to sell, or some blankets, or all the other wonderful things these sites contain.
While pot hunters still plunder dozens of sites in the Southwest each year, archaeologists have changed their methods drastically. New remote sensing technology allows them to plan exactly where to dig beforehand and see beneath the soil without even lifting a spade. Today's archaeology is indeed different from the old days. High technology will allow Dale and Phil to see beneath the soil before they even lift a spade, thereby allowing them to avoid disturbing human remains.
Right across this area, right through here.
First, they stake out a reference grid that will help them pinpoint the location of any buried features seen by this device. It's an antenna that transmits a ground-penetrating radar signal into the earth. Similar in principle to an earthquake detector, but with a much higher frequency signal, which will bounce off anything unusual underground.
For example, if a pit has been dug and then afterwards covered up, and the ground-penetrating radar passes across that point, the place where the pit has been covered will be different from the surrounding soil that has not been disturbed. once the natural soil profile is disturbed, it stays disturbed, and it's something that the GPR instrument system can find and determine.
So the machine picks up reflections from disturbed soil, buried rocks, objects, or bones, and the fraction of a second it takes the signal to bounce back tells the machine how deep the object or layer is. The result? A continuous map of the hidden world beneath their feet. They can review the map on the spot, but in a computer lab, the radar record is even more revealing.
This particular line here, you can see the normal geology, and again there's a disturbed zone, and this disturbed zone has the normal geology above it, so it's another place that was disturbed a long time ago. The geology had time to settle in above it, and this is something that should be dug up by the archaeologist and investigated. It's probably a very interesting undisturbed site. The pot hunters haven't found it yet.
So like eyes beneath the soil, the radar helps them plan the dig. They know in advance where to expect ancient pits, burials, or pot hunters' holes. Early morning in Combe Wash. It's already 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will be 100 by noon. A team of volunteers from the Four Corners School begins the quarter-mile trek up to Old Man Cave. But there are always surprises once they finally begin to probe the soil. The exceptionally dry conditions in the cave have preserved materials that would normally be destroyed, such as fragments of an 8,000-year-old sandal woven from yucca, nearly identical to the one in the museum that led Phil to the site in the first place.
So here's the sandal fragment. Now that we took it out of the deposit, there's still sediment underneath here, ashy charcoal sediment. And it's actually resting on top of a mono fragment, something they would have used to grind small seeds with. And they threw it out in the trash. It's just part of the trash deposit. And it's just fortuitous that it's resting on the mono. You can see how the loop here is draped over the surface. Very open sort of sandal. They usually packed it with grass or juniper bark to make it a little more comfortable. Quick to make, though. An experienced person could make one of these in one sandal in perhaps about 10 minutes or so. So they're sort of a disposable technology.
But what was life really like for the people who wore the sandals 8,000 years ago? R.G. Matson of the University of British Columbia is an authority on these ancient desert dwellers.
The archaic people here, the ones who lived here 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, made their living by hunting and gathering. They probably hunted a wide range of animals. We have remains of deer, for instance, in this cave. And they also gathered a number of different things.
To recover animal bones, seeds, and other evidence of diet, the excavators carefully sift each bucket load through a fine mesh screen, even though it kicks up a choking dust.
The one gathering thing that we have a lot of evidence for is spirabolus, or dropseed grass. And the other two sites of this age also have lots of evidence of dropseed grass. So that was one of their staples. They probably moved very frequently over the landscape, so that they never stayed in an area more than a few weeks at a time. So they cleaned out the resources in an area, the animals, the plant resources, and then they'd move on to another area. But they probably made fairly regular annual rounds.
Surprisingly, clues about the archaic people even come from the vegetation surrounding Old Man Cave today. Nancy Coulomb of the U.S. National Park Service is a botanical expert who is comparing present-day plants with the evidence of those consumed by the cave dwellers 8,000 years ago.
The big question for us is, what was life like for these people? And a big chunk of that life is going out looking for plants. And so we need to know how far on a daily basis did people have to travel to go get lunch and dinner.
The remains of ancient lunches and dinners are right here in the dirt. The excavators are probing a prehistoric hearth. They will sift it for traces of ancient pollen and seeds.
So we are picking up the results of prehistoric accidents in the kitchen. And by looking at lots of those accidents from different hearths all across a site and then all across a region, we can determine fairly well what people are cooking. These people had a tremendous impact on their environment, and they created the environment to some extent that we see around us today. They ripped up whole plants. It's really common. What you find is you find whole grass clumps that they have ripped out of the ground and brought back to their cave, and they then extracted the seeds there. They were not exactly ecologically minded.
So did they thoughtlessly strip whole canyons of their vegetation and then move on? Or did they carefully protect or even propagate the wild grasses so crucial to their survival? Someday soon, science may have the answer. The American Southwest is a storehouse of archaeological treasures. A conservative estimate would be 500,000 sites. But that rich legacy is darkened by continuing vandalism, ruthless robbing by collectors and pot hunters, and contempt for the remains of ancient Native Americans buried at the sites.
Vandals like to express what they do as not being grave robbing. You know, they're looking for artifacts, they're doing anything else, but they're not grave robbing. But in fact, the kinds of artifacts they look for in the modern day, pots, blankets, the things that they can find a most ready market for, are from graves. So there's no way that that you can come to any other conclusion than they're grave robbers. That's right. And anyone who do that is showing the worst kind of disrespect that I can think of.
In their work at Old Man Cave, the archaeologists have already used ground-penetrating radar to alert them to likely burial places within the cave. But as they begin digging down through the layers, they come across obvious signs of a prehistoric human grave dug into the site long after the period of the Archaic hunters.
We started an excavation unit right here, 1 meter square, and just shortly into it, we discovered there was a break in the strata with a pit, an intrusive pit feature. After a little bit of exposing, we realized we had a knee of an individual interment that had not been looted yet by the pot hunters. Once we discovered it was a burial, we shifted over our excavation to here because we're not interested in disturbing human remains. We were interested in getting down to the early archaic deposits. So we shifted our unit over and kept going down. And then we encountered this other feature here, which is a rock-lined pit that also starts up at the Basketmaker 2 level. It might be a burial as well, and so we wanted to stay away from it. And so we're sort of caught between two areas here, and so we had to cut around both of them and excavate down. Native Americans find it terribly offensive for archaeologists to be digging up their ancestors or, anyone who is Native American and treating them like objects of study, not treating them as with reverence or not treating them as human remains, but treating them like artifacts, essentially. At this site, we've tried to be sensitive to that. We've tried to avoid the human remains to the extent possible, and we haven't been purposely excavating for them. When we find them, we've had to move our excavation to try to avoid them. We have surface collected all the remains that were disturbed and left around here from previous looting at the site and reinterred them in a specific spot. At some point, they might get proper reburial if we can notify, the appropriate tribes that would be interested in such a practice or a rite of reburial.
But what about the tens of thousands of Native American skeletons still boxed up in museum storerooms? A recent statement by the organization American Indians Against Desecration concludes, with 500,000 of our ancestors in laboratories, museums, and universities, we suggest it is now time to have some serious discussions on the meaning of respect.
There have been hundreds and hundreds of bodies that have sat around in museums for 100 years or more and have not received very much study. So it's hard to defend a position when you haven't done anything with all these existing collections. Oh, why do you need more? It's a matter of equal treatment. We treat Anglo graves one way, we treat Indian graves another way. And it's just a matter of trying to bring the two together. So we have equal treatment. And it's not a bigoted way of approaching lives.
The lives of today's Pueblo peoples speak to us of an extraordinary, centuries-old heritage, founded on reverence for the Anasazi ancestors who, like them, must have celebrated the return of the sun and the life-giving rains. Today, science has taught us much about those ancestors and about the still earlier hunters of the Archaic. Often, our knowledge has come at the expense of Native American values. Pot hunters and vandals continue to threaten the ancient graves. But with the help of sophisticated remote sensing technology, archaeologists can now excavate a site without destroying or even touching skeletal remains. Now, perhaps, a new way forward for archaeologists in the Southwest is possible.